Every day, billions of people open a refrigerator without a second thought. But for most of human history, there was no such thing. How did our ancestors keep food from spoiling? The answer is a story of ingenuity, science, and survival, a global toolkit of methods that worked without electricity. The oldest method was drying. By removing moisture, early humans stopped bacteria and mold from growing. They hung meat and fish in the sun, over fire, or in the wind. This simple trick could preserve food for months. Another ancient technique was fermentation. By adding salt or beneficial bacteria, people transformed perishable foods into stable, tangy products. Cabbage became sauerkraut, milk became cheese, and fish was preserved in brine. These methods didn't just keep food safe, they created new flavors. In cold climates, people used ice and snow. They cut blocks from frozen lakes and stored them in underground ice houses, packed with straw. This allowed them to keep meat, butter, and even fruits cold through the summer. It was nature's original refrigerator. Electricity. From the Arctic to the Sahara, every culture found a way. And some of those methods are still in use today. Before refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant threat. Bacteria, molds, and enzymes break down organic matter, and without intervention, fresh food lasts only days. Ancient peoples didn't have freezers, but they had ingenuity. They learned to manipulate temperature, humidity, and air to slow decay. One of the oldest tricks was drying. Sun, wind, and fire could remove moisture from meat, fish, and fruit. Without water, bacteria can't thrive. Jerky, dried fish, and dried dates could last for months. In cold climates, people used ice and snow. They cut blocks from frozen lakes and stored them in underground pits, creating natural refrigerators. This was ice harvesting, and it became In the 19th century, ice harvesting became big business. Companies cut ice from northern lakes and shipped it around the world. Insulated with sawdust, the ice could survive long sea voyages. By the 1850s, ice was being delivered to homes in cities like London and New York. People stored it in ice boxes, wooden cabinets lined with metal or zinc, with a compartment for a block of ice. The melting ice cooled the food above it. But natural ice had limits. It melted, it was heavy, and it couldn't create freezing temperatures. For that, you needed mechanical refrigeration. The first working vapor compression refrigerator was built by Jacob Perkins in 1834. It used ether as a refrigerant, but early machines were expensive and dangerous. Ether is highly flammable. It took decades of tinkering to make refrigeration safe and affordable. Know about microbes, but they understood cause and effect. They observed that certain conditions, cold, dryness, salt, smoke, kept food edible longer. The basic principles are simple. Inhibit microbial growth by removing water, lowering temperature, increasing acidity, or creating a hostile chemical environment. These principles were discovered independently on every continent, long before anyone knew what a microbe. Take salt, for instance. Salt curing works by osmosis. Salt draws water out of food cells and also out of any bacteria present, dehydrating them to death. Ancient Egyptians used natron, a natural salt mixture, to dry and preserve fish and meat. In Mesopotamia, salt was rubbed into cuts of meat. In China, salt was used to preserve vegetables, creating early forms of pickling. The same principle, different continents, same result, longer shelf life. Smoking is another ancient method. When wood burns, it releases compounds like formaldehyde and acetic acid that have antimicrobial properties. The smoke also dries the surface of the food, creating a barrier against spoilage. Indigenous peoples in North America smoked salmon over alder wood. In Scandinavia, fish was smoked over birch. In the Amazon, meat was smoked over tropical hardwoods. Each culture used local woods, but fermentation is perhaps the most transformative method. Instead of just inhibiting microbes, it uses beneficial ones to outcompete harmful bacteria. Lactic acid bacteria, for example, convert sugars into acid, lowering the pH and creating an environment where pathogens cannot survive. This gave us yogurt, cheese, sauerkraut, kimchi, and countless other foods. Fermentation not only preserved food, but also enhanced its. Some methods required elaborate preparation. In Mesopotamia, around 2500 BCE, people built large clay ovens called tanners. They would stack layers of meat and grain inside, seal the oven with clay, and bake it slowly for hours. The heat drove out moisture, and the seal kept out bacteria. The result was a dry, edible product that could last for months. Others were as simple as digging a hole. In cold climates, people stored food in underground pits lined with straw or leaves. The earth acted as a natural insulator, keeping temperatures cool and stable. This method, known as pit storage, was used from Scandinavia to Siberia. It required no special tools, only labor and knowledge but all of them transformed human society. Preservation allowed for settled communities, long-distance trade, and the rise of cities. Without it, civilization as we know it would not exist. Food could be stockpiled for winter, traded across regions, and used to support armies and artisans. The ability to store surplus changed The methods varied, but the science was universal. From drying fish in Norway to fermenting cabbage in Korea, every culture discovered ways to preserve food. These techniques were not just recipes, they were the foundation of human progress. They allowed people to survive harsh seasons, explore new lands, and build the first great civilizations. No, it would not exist. For a hunter-gatherer, a successful hunt meant a feast, but also a race against time. A single large animal could provide hundreds of pounds of meat. Without preservation, most of that meat would rot within days. The tribe had to eat quickly or lose the precious calories to scavengers and decay. This constant pressure drove innovation. Somewhere, someone noticed that meat left near a smoky fire lasted longer. The smoke seemed to keep insects away, and the meat dried out, making it less hospitable to bacteria. This was the accidental birth of smoking Over time, this technique was refined. Different woods produced different flavors and levels of preservation. Hardwoods like hickory and oak burned slowly and gave a rich taste. Softwoods like pine were avoided because they made the meat taste like turpentine. Smoking became both a science and an art, passed down through generations. Smoking did more than preserve food. It transformed the flavor, making meat more palatable and easier to chew. This allowed early humans to store surplus meat for lean times, supporting larger communities and more complex societies. The simple act of hanging meat over a fire changed the course of the food, but with drying, smoking, or freezing, that same meat could feed a family for months. Survival depended on these techniques. In agricultural societies, harvest seasons created a different problem: a glut of grain, vegetables, or fruit that had to last until the next season. Grain could be stored in silos or granaries, but without proper drying, it would rot or be eaten by pests. Be stored in silos or granaries, but without proper drying, it would rot or be eaten by pests. So communities built raised granaries with good ventilation, and they dried grains in the sun before storage. Fermentation was another ancient method. It didn't just preserve food, it transformed it. Milk became yogurt or cheese, which lasted much longer. Cabbage turned into sauerkraut, providing vitamin C. Cabbage turned into sauerkraut, providing vitamin C through the winter. Pickling in brine or vinegar preserved vegetables and fruits for months. In cold climates, people stored root vegetables in underground cellars or buried them in the ground, insulated by straw and earth. Ice houses allowed the wealthy to keep ice and snow into summer, but for most, winter itself was Ice houses allowed the wealthy to keep ice and snow into summer, but for most, winter itself was nature's refrigerator. These methods, drying, smoking, fermenting, pickling, cellaring, were not just about survival. They shaped cuisines and cultures. Fermented foods like kimchi, pickles, and cheese became staples. Dried meats like jerky and prosciutto became delicacies. Preservation was the invisible force that allowed civilizations to grow. Be stored in dry silos, but vegetables and fruits needed other methods. Fermentation, pickling, and root cellars became essential. Failure meant hunger, malnutrition, or starvation. Preservation wasn't a luxury, it was a matter of life and death. One of the oldest methods is drying. By removing water, you make it impossible for bacteria and mold to grow. Sun-drying was simple. Lay out slices of fruit or meat on rocks or mats under the hot sun. But sun-drying depended on weather. In cloudy or humid regions, people turned to smoking. Hanging strips of meat or fish over a slow fire did more than cook. The smoke contained chemicals that slowed spoilage and kept insects away. Smoking also added flavor, a welcome bonus. Another method was salting. Salt draws moisture out of food through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria cannot survive. Meat and fish were Fermentation was a different approach. Instead of killing microbes, it encouraged the growth of friendly ones. By submerging vegetables in a saltwater brine, lactic acid bacteria would multiply, producing acid that preserved the food and gave it a tangy taste. Sauerkraut and kimchi are famous examples. Pickling with vinegar worked similarly. The acid environment prevented spoilage. These methods didn't just store food, they transformed it. Root cellars offered a low-tech solution for whole communities. By digging a cellar underground, people took advantage of the Earth's stable temperature and humidity. Apples, potatoes, carrots, and cabbages could last for months. The cellar was dark, cool, and damp, perfect conditions for many fruits and vegetables. It required no fuel, no salt, no special equipment, just a shovel and some knowledge. These methods allowed civilizations to survive winter. It was impossible for bacteria and fungi to grow. In the Middle East, dates and figs were dried in the sun. In the Andes, potatoes were freeze-dried into chuño. In Scandinavia, cod was air-dried into stockfish. Stockfish was so durable that Viking explorers carried it on voyages across the Atlantic. The principle was simple: remove water, stop spoilage, but drying had limits. It could take days or weeks, and in humid climates, food often rotted before it could dry. People needed a faster, more reliable method. That method arrived with fire. When early humans discovered that smoke could preserve meat and fish, they had found a tool that worked in any climate. Smoking did more than dry food. The chemicals in wood smoke, like formaldehyde and acetic acid, created an acidic layer on the surface that killed bacteria. The heat also drove out moisture, and the smoke itself formed a protective barrier against insects. Smoking became a cornerstone of food preservation across cultures. In North America, indigenous peoples smoked salmon over alder wood. In Europe, ham and sausages were hung in smokehouses. In China, tea leaves were sometimes added to the fire for flavor. Smoking didn't just preserve food, it transformed it, creating new tastes that people began to crave. The Atlantic, it could last for years without spoiling. Smoking combines drying with chemical preservation. Smoke contains compounds like formaldehyde and acetic acid that inhibit microbial growth. Native American tribes smoked salmon and bison. In Europe, ham and fish were smoked in chimneys. The technique is still used today, especially for meats and cheeses. In the Middle Ages, smoking was essential for preserving food through long winters. But smoking had a downside. The same compounds that preserved food also deposited carcinogens like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons onto the surface. People didn't know this then. They just knew smoked food tasted good and lasted long. Salt was another ancient preservative. It works by osmosis. Salt draws water out of food cells and also out of microbial cells, killing them or stopping their growth. The Romans salted fish to make garum, a fermented fish sauce. In China, salt was used to preserve vegetables, making pickles. Salt pork and beef were staples on pickling in vinegar or brine was also common. Vinegar is acidic, with a pH low enough to kill most bacteria. Cucumbers, cabbage, and onions were pickled. In Korea, vegetables were fermented with salt and spices to make kimchi. In Germany, sauerkraut provided vitamin C during winter. These methods didn't just preserve food, they created new flavors that became central to cuisines around the world. Today, for flavor and preservation, salting is another ancient method. Salt draws water out of food through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria cannot survive. The Romans salted fish to make garum, a fermented fish sauce that was a staple of their cuisine. Salt cod became a trade commodity that connected continents. In medieval Europe, salt was so valuable it was used as currency. The word salary comes from the Latin word for salt, but salt is not the only preservative. Sugar in high concentrations also prevents spoilage by binding water. Fruit preserves and jams rely on this principle. Smoking is another technique that combines drying with chemical preservation. Smoke contains compounds like formaldehyde and acetic acid that inhibit microbial growth. Indigenous peoples in North America smoked salmon over alder wood, creating a nutritious food that could last through winter. Fermentation is perhaps the most transformative preservation method. It uses beneficial microorganisms to outcompete harmful ones. Lactic acid bacteria convert sugars into acid, pickling the food naturally. Sauerkraut, kimchi, and yogurt are all products of fermentation. This process not only preserves but also creates. Fermentation uses beneficial microbes to outcompete harmful ones. Lactic acid bacteria produce acid that preserves the food and adds flavor. Sauerkraut in Germany, kimchi in Korea, pickles in India, and miso in Japan, all are products of fermentation. Each culture developed its own signature. Fermentation. Good across the Atlantic. Fermentation uses beneficial microbes to outcompete harmful ones. Lactic acid bacteria produce acid that preserves the food and adds flavor. Sauerkraut in Germany, kimchi in Korea, pickles in India, and miso in Japan all are products of fermentation. Each culture developed its own signature. Fermentation also produced alcoholic beverages, which were often safer to drink than water. Beer and wine were common in many ancient societies. Cold storage was used wherever natural ice or snow was available. In Persia, ice houses called Yakhchāl kept ice. In China, ice was harvested from rivers in winter and stored in underground pits for summer use. The Chinese also developed early forms of refrigeration using ice and salt mixtures. The Romans used snow from mountains, packed it into insulated containers, and stored it in underground chambers called neveria. They also used evaporative cooling by placing porous clay pots in water. In India, evaporative cooling was used with porous clay pots and wet mats. The matka pot kept water cool through evaporation. These methods show how ancient people used natural principles to preserve food and stay comfortable. Harvested from rivers and stored in insulated cellars. The Roman Emperor Nero had snow brought from the mountains for his table. Archaeological evidence confirms these methods. At the site of Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey, dating to 7000 BCE, researchers found evidence of grain storage in sealed. These ancient storage techniques were remarkably effective. By keeping grain in sealed, cool environments, early farmers prevented spoilage and ensured food security through harsh winter. This practice of cold storage laid the groundwork for later innovations in food preservation, from ice houses to modern refrigeration. In the Swiss Alps, the 5,300-year-old mummy known as Ötzi was found with dried meat and berries in his pack, evidence of portable preserved food. In the deserts of Egypt, archaeologists have found jars of honey that are over 3,000 years old and still edible. Honey's low water content and acidic pH create an environment where bacteria and microorganisms cannot survive. This natural preservation allows honey to remain edible for millennia, making it a perfect survival food for ancient travelers. The Romans built large-scale saltworks along the Mediterranean coast. At Pompeii, excavations revealed shops selling salted fish and garum. In the Andes, the Inca used freeze-drying for potatoes. They exposed them to freezing night temperatures and then crushed them to remove water, producing chuño. The process of freeze-drying relied on the region's extreme temperature swings. By day, the sun warmed the potatoes, and by night, they froze solid. The resulting chuño could be stored for years, providing a reliable food source during harsh winters or crop failures.